The Tongs, Chinese secret societies, have a multifaceted history marked by both community organization and involvement in criminal activities. These organizations originated as a vital means of support for Chinese immigrants, offering protection and a sense of belonging in the face of exclusion and adversity. Over time, however, the Tongs became synonymous with illicit activities, contributing to their dark and mysterious reputation. To truly understand the Tongs, one must explore their evolution, structure, influence, and legacy in greater detail, particularly their significant role in shaping Chinese immigrant communities during a time of intense discrimination and hardship. The history of the Tongs can be traced back to secret societies in China, such as the Triads, which had political and social motivations. These groups arose in response to the corruption and oppression of the ruling authorities, particularly during periods of instability. Their clandestine nature was essential for survival in an authoritarian state where dissent was met with harsh punishment. The tradition of secret societies persisted, eventually migrating overseas with Chinese immigrants in the 19th century. In the mid-19th century, Chinese immigrants began to arrive in the United States and other countries in search of economic opportunities. Most came to work as laborers, initially drawn by the gold rush and later by the demand for cheap labor in industries like railroads and agriculture. However, upon arrival, they faced harsh working conditions, exploitation, and intense racial discrimination. Mainstream society offered little in the way of protection or assistance to these immigrants, forcing them to turn inward and rely on their own communities for support. The Tongs emerged in response to this difficult environment, providing essential services such as housing, legal aid, and financial support to new immigrants. At their core, the Tongs were fraternal organizations that helped Chinese immigrants navigate a foreign and often hostile society. These groups helped newcomers find employment, provided loans, and even offered social and religious activities. They served as a lifeline for many immigrants who would have otherwise been left to fend for themselves in a system stacked against them. As the number of Chinese immigrants increased, so did the size and influence of the Tongs. In cities with large Chinese populations, particularly in North America, the Tongs became powerful institutions within Chinatown communities. However, as the Tongs expanded, they also began to shift toward more illicit activities, driven by a combination of necessity, opportunity, and greed. One of the key factors behind the Tongs' move into criminal activity was the exclusionary laws and policies that were imposed on Chinese immigrants during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 in the United States, for example, severely restricted Chinese immigration and limited the rights of Chinese immigrants already living in the country. This law and others like it cut off legitimate economic opportunities for many Chinese immigrants, forcing them into the underground economy. As a result, the Tongs began to operate illegal gambling dens, brothels, and opium houses. They also became involved in human trafficking, particularly the smuggling of Chinese laborers into countries that had restricted Chinese immigration. The Tongs operated these enterprises under a veil of secrecy, using their connections and influence to avoid law enforcement and maintain control over their territories. The rise of criminal activity within the Tongs led to violent power struggles, both within individual Tongs and between rival groups. These conflicts, known as Tong Wars, erupted in major cities like San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. These wars were fought over control of illegal businesses, territorial disputes, and leadership challenges, with assassinations and street battles becoming common occurrences. The Tong Wars were highly destructive and often terrorized local communities. In some cases, innocent residents were caught in the crossfire as rival Tongs sought to assert dominance through violence and intimidation. These wars typically involved small, organized factions within the Tongs and were often fought with swords, hatchets, and firearms. The intense rivalries between Tongs also created divisions within the larger Chinese community, further complicating efforts to establish a unified front against external threats. Despite the violence, these wars also served to solidify the power of the Tongs, particularly those that emerged victorious from the conflicts. These dominant Tongs could then exert control over entire sections of Chinatown, dictating everything from business operations to social relations. Tongs were highly secretive organizations, structured similarly to other fraternal societies. At the top of the hierarchy were the leaders, known as Big Brothers or Elders, who wielded significant authority over the Tongs' operations. Beneath them were various ranks of lieutenants, enforcers, and members, each with specific roles within the organization. Membership in a Tong was exclusive, often restricted to men of Chinese descent. Initiates had to undergo elaborate initiation rituals that drew upon traditional Chinese beliefs and practices. These rituals were designed to promote loyalty and secrecy among members, with oaths sworn to protect the Tong at all costs. Disloyalty was harshly punished, and members who betrayed the Tong faced severe consequences, including death. The Tongs also had a system of symbols and codes that allowed members to identify one another and communicate in secrecy. These symbols often had connections to Chinese mythology or folklore, and they were used to maintain the clandestine nature of the organization. This culture of secrecy was critical to the Tongs' ability to operate in the shadows, both in terms of their legitimate and illegitimate activities. While the Tongs became notorious for their involvement in organized crime, they also wielded considerable political influence within their communities. In many Chinatowns, Tongs acted as the de facto government, controlling access to resources, mediating disputes, and providing social services that mainstream society failed to offer. The power of the Tongs extended beyond just the criminal underworld. They also influenced local politics and had connections to powerful figures in mainstream society. In some cases, Tongs used their influence to protect their communities from external threats. For example, during times of racial violence against Chinese immigrants, Tongs would organize defensive efforts to protect residents and businesses. They also helped immigrants navigate the legal system, offering legal aid and sometimes even bribing officials to secure better treatment for Chinese residents. Tongs also played a role in larger political movements. In the early 20th century, some Tongs supported anti-colonial and nationalist causes in China. They provided funds and resources to revolutionary movements, including the efforts to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish the Republic of China. Others aligned themselves with the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, which sought to unify China and resist foreign influence. By the mid-20th century, the influence of the Tongs began to wane. Several factors contributed to their decline, including increased law enforcement efforts, changing immigration patterns, and shifts in the structure of Chinese communities. The rise of other community organizations such as family associations and merchant guilds also diminished the Tongs' role as the primary power brokers in Chinatown. Law enforcement agencies, particularly in the United States, began to target Tongs more aggressively in the early 20th century. High-profile raids on gambling dens and opium houses, combined with crackdowns on human trafficking operations, weakened the financial power of the Tongs. Additionally, the federal government passed new laws aimed at curbing organized crime, further limiting the Tongs' ability to operate. At the same time, changes in immigration law, such as the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943, allowed for new waves of Chinese immigrants to enter the United States. These immigrants were less reliant on the Tongs for support, and many of them sought to integrate more fully into mainstream society. The growing acceptance of Chinese Americans in broader society reduced the need for insular, secretive organizations like the Tongs. Though their power has diminished, Tongs continue to exist today, though their role has evolved. In some places, Tongs have transformed themselves into cultural and charitable organizations, focusing on preserving Chinese traditions and supporting community development. They engage in activities such as organizing festivals, providing scholarships, and assisting with community events. These modern Tongs are a far cry from the violent, secretive organizations of the past, though their legacy remains. The history of the Tongs is one of contrasts. They began as benevolent organizations meant to support Chinese immigrants in a foreign land, but over time, many became deeply involved in organized crime. Despite their criminal activities, the Tongs played a critical role in the survival and development of Chinese immigrant communities. They were protectors, organizers, and at times, exploiters of their people. Their legacy continues to be felt today, both in the remnants of criminal organizations that still bear the Tong name and in the cultural and charitable groups that have emerged from their foundations.